Thank you, and thank you for coming today. Okay, so I thought I'd just talk a bit about what inspired me to write this novel. So, because I've been working in the theater all my life, and I've always had ideas to like expand stories, and I knew I wanted to write a comic novel, and I knew I wanted to write it about the theater. And so I wrote about a central character who works in the theater, but I knew I also wanted to explore the themes of redemption and perdition. And what interests me are sort of those scrappy underdogs in life that are trying to get like a foothold, you know, on life and achieve some kind of state of grace, or at least a reconciliation of self on that note. And I want to write in the humor vein. Comedy to me is so important because it's like, look at us right now. The humor is that kind of exchange that we have every day that if we didn't, we'd all jump off buildings, right? And we all know that. So, and I'm fascinated by kind of the outrageousness of human behavior. I think we're all irrational creatures and we pretend to be rational and we convince ourselves. And so that idea of looking at how foolish we can be as human beings, and it's often that hard-won journey to wisdom. So that's sort of what I've been exploring. And in this book, the central character is Will Crosswell. And Will Crosswell begins as an actor in the late 70s, going to acting school. And his life is one kind of shipwreck after another in terms of working in the theater, in terms of relationships. He finally takes a job, which is kind of like on the bottom rung of life as a telemarketer. That goes terribly wrong. Anyhow, he ends up hitting rock bottom, and he's in AA, where he has a very interesting experience and meets a very unconventional minister. And so in his mid-50s, he ends up enrolling in divinity school. And part of his schooling is he has to take this 40-day fast to see if he's got the calling. And so he decides, all his classmates are going off to Egypt, you know, in Judea, hot climates. But he decides, I'm going to serve in Canada, so I'm going to go to Newfoundland. So he goes to a little outport called Witless Bay in the middle of January in Newfoundland, in the freezing winter, just him, 3 pieces of bread a day and tea. And it's what happens to him on those 40 days. And then we find out, does he survive? Does he have the calling? Does it all work out? Does he find his purpose, his mighty purpose in life? And that you'll find out when you read the book, okay? So what I'm gonna read right now is 2 chapters. The very first chapter of the book where we meet the character in acting school, and then one of his earliest adventures in the theater, okay? All right. Will's decision to pursue acting shattered his father's dream of him being a useful adult. His father had tried to teach him the ins and outs of transmissions, but Will had elected to sing in a church choir instead. You behave like you're better than your own family, singing with a bunch of uppity Anglicans rather than attending the United where you were baptized. His father had roared when Will announced that he and Christopher McBain were joining St. Luke's Men and Boys Choir. You never go, so why should it matter? Will had argued back. He had a point. If he was going to be a Christian, then his father was the worst kind, the hypocritical holiday type preferring to tinker in his workshop than actually attend Sunday service. Will's great-uncle William, his namesake and a Mason, had ordered Will's mother to leave her family's Methodist church and join the Crosswell family at St. Paul's United, a condition of marrying Will's father. His father eventually gave up on Will and showered his gifts on his younger brother. Theater school is a fun house of mirrors, announced Douglas Carmichael, the school's director, greeting the new recruits on day 1. In Shakespeare's day, great plays were thought of as mirrors. When you are acting, you are looking into a mirror, a special mirror that reflects the world in the way that allows you to see its true nature, and not only reflects the world around you, but you as well. Will quickly learned how smudged that special mirror really was and how distorted its world. For there was nothing politically correct about training for acting in the late 70s. Professors slept with their prize students, kept scotch in their desk drawers, and chain-smoked in class. They were meddling gods, mind-screwing the impressionable students into their clutches and conflicting methodologies. The devouring of the students' self-esteem was a foregone conclusion. Most of the students wouldn't tough it out and would never work in the industry, becoming elementary school teachers or high school drama teachers. Will was an exception. A childhood of arguing with his father had prepared him for acting boot camp. Miss Morrison, his movement and dance instructor, was a bitter ex-dancer who began teaching at the school after a knee injury ended her ballet career. Miss Morrison chain-smoked Russian cigarettes down to one long ash until it fell to the floor with little regard to the sanctity of the rehearsal hall, is decreed by Lawrence Richardson, the school's acting instructor, a refined New Yorker of the loose-fitting cardigan variety. Miss Morrison particularly hated the two beautiful lean girls in Will's class who could actually dance. She ordered the students to parade before her in their bathing suits. "It's like they're boarding the train for Auschwitz," muttered Will, pointing out those girls with poor body images to the young French-Canadian beside him, which was pretty much all of them. Once the last slope-postured student had crossed the stage, Miss Morrison dissected the class's physical deformities and put each student on academic probation. Will was a skinny 19-year-old, so put on 20 pounds of hard muscle by Christmas break, Mr. Crosswell. If not, do not bother coming back in January. So he hit the school gym, pumped iron, and put on muscle. He was told to get contact lenses, and he did. Anything to avoid being turned to stone by her glare. Will's speech instructor, Warner Tompkins, was a lazy, sweet-natured alcoholic from England with a belly the size of a beach ball. He would relentlessly go on and on and on with his stories of working in the theater, especially his glorious Stratford Festival days. He addressed the students as either love or darling. Old Warner taught a course actually called the applications of breathing. Will wondered, how could he fail it? Bring a puffer to the exam? One Friday afternoon after speech class, Will bet a few of his mates that he could fake a monologue on the spot and old Warner would buy it. A case of beer to the victor. The droning speeches began, Tom, Biff, and St. Joan, the usual suspects. When it came Will's turn, he burst into a Belfast accent, improvising the agonizing story of an Irish Catholic priest who knocked up a Protestant maid during the Troubles. He blarneyed away for 5 minutes and finished by falling to his knees with an anguished plea for God's forgiveness. He didn't know that one day his life would imitate his art, that one day he would be begging for forgiveness for more than a 2-4. The writer's name, Will explained to old Warner, is Patty O'Furniture, a minor Northern Irish poet and playwright whose work I found in an anthology of rare plays at the research library. His mates groaned at the over-obvious pun. Will was pushing it. The play, he further explained, is entitled White Collar, Black Heart. Old Warner scrutinized Will for a steely moment. Will was afraid he was going to ask him to repeat it. His mates grinned at his impending undoing. Jean-Paul, a classmate from Gaspé, who could mime just about anything, and did, leaned in. "You're in for it now, Crosswell," he whispered. Will was fucked. "Lovely choice, darling, lovely choice," old Warner rhapsodized. "The self-torture of your agonized soul was so raw, and your delivery so natural, I'd swear they were your words if I didn't know any better. I shall have to read this, Paddy Furniture, and thank you for going to the library, that mysterious cave most of you have not set foot in. Thank you for going the extra mile. This, loves, is what it's all about." Later that night, on the theater school roof, Will shared the spoils of his labors with his mates. Possessing a Prince Hal relaxed rebelliousness, casually misogynistic, and entirely narcissistic, Will was the definite ringleader of his troupe. In his second year, he'd bedded most of the first-year girls by Thanksgiving, a trend that would continue for the next 2 years. His rakish reputation, rather than driving girls away, served as a natural magnet, for he was a straightforward wolf in wolf's clothing, a far less offensive thing than the false sheep of his contemporaries. During his final year, the CBC filmed a documentary at the school on the life of Terry Horse. Mr. Horse was a famous Canadian actor, best remembered for his long-running cheesy science fiction series Star Quest in the 60s and his signature Kit Kat chocolate bar commercials. Mr. Horse directed Will's graduating class in a dreadful workshop adaptation of Julius Caesar, set in a futuristic space station orbiting the moon. The actors carried Kit Kat chocolate bars instead of daggers, Terry explaining to their telly and the biz virgin ears, as he put it, that product endorsement is a lucky break for any actor. He too regaled them with his glorious Stratford days, his sole directorial note for every scene: more air, loves. More air, keep your text in the air, don't drop it, don't let it hit the ground. Most of the time, Terry would compare a scene to an episode of his television series and soon be off at another anecdote. Julius Caesar was slowly, painfully assassinated by the steady outpouring of Terry's hot air. The director of the documentary finished the shoot, having the students rush out of the theater school entrance, greet Mr. Horse, and thank him for his brilliance. Jean-Paul and Will were the first ones out the door to shake hands with him, and racing back inside through the back entrance, they were the last two to shake hands with him again. Terry was too self-involved to notice they were glad-handing him a second time. By this point, the director didn't care. Okay. All right. So, this next chapter, I guess to give you a bit of background, there's been a lot of controversy over the years regarding the authorship of Shakespeare's plays, right? And one of the theories is that Edward de Vere, the Earl of Oxford, is the true author of Shakespeare's plays, okay? So this is where the book sort of moves into satire around that. All right. Artistic director Terence Richards certainly had the gaze. He was the man behind the helm of the newly formed Dominion de Vere Drama Festival in Prince Edward County. The de Vere Festival was the brainchild of Walter de Vere Leclerc, a descendant of Edward de Vere, 17th Earl of Oxford, thought by a number of historians and literary scholars to be the true author of Shakespeare's works. Walter Leclerc proposed that Edward de Vere wrote the plays and then passed them off to Ben Jonson to take credit, while de Vere remained anonymous for reasons of social acceptability. But an uncouth, illiterate actor named William Shakespeare stepped in to claim credit, hijacking de Vere's plays into the public theaters. Leclerc believed it was the biggest political cover-up of English history. The passion of Walter Leclerc was infectious. He convinced a number of wealthy scholars, philanthropists, and businessmen to build a national theater in Prince Edward County. The Dominion de Vere Drama Festival opened its doors in 1984, 380 years after de Vere's death. The opening season playbill was carefully selected by Terence Richards to reflect de Vere's incestuous relationship with Queen Elizabeth I, Richard III, Hamlet, A Midsummer Night's Dream, and Twelfth Night. The Marquis boldly declared Edward de Vere as author. The controversy surrounding the new festival, particularly from Shakespeare purists, created quite a stir in the media, translating into huge ticket sales. Walter Leclerc's dream was a smashing success. Will's agent got him the audition. From his actor friends, he'd heard all the stories of Terence Richards' unconventional audition methods, asking young men to imagine they were masturbating in the shower, or making them take off their shirts and do push-ups until their muscles gleamed. He arrived a half hour early, already warmed up and ready to work. The actor before him stormed out of his audition cursing, "Fucking wanker," and left the building. "Here we go," Will muttered under his breath and entered the rehearsal hall. Terence was casually smoking and crossing the previous actor's name off his list with a flourish of his jeweled ballpoint pen. He looked up when Will opened the door. Will strode over to him and Terence gracefully stood up, his bemused eye taking in Will's lean, fit physique and bulging crotch. Will deliberately wore tight jeans and a tighter t-shirt, as well as his well-worn cowboy boots. He had a surprise for Terence. Forewarned was forearmed. Terence was dressed in white chinos, an untucked white linen shirt unbuttoned to his navel, and sandals. He was handsome and looked considerably younger than his 30-something years, a number he preferred to keep unlisted. Will shook his hand firmly, handed him his resume and headshot, and then introduced himself. "A pleasure to meet you, sir." "William Crosswell, is it?" he said, sitting back down and perfunctorily scanning his resume. Will is fine. Will, is it? I trust not of the Bardian variety. No, sir, I've gone by Will since I was a boy. That is good. We wouldn't want any secret Shakespeares lurking about, now would we? I guess not. Will was trying his best not to back himself into a corner. You guess not. Your will is the only will I, as Will, want to serve, upon my will. Nicely done, Mr. Crosswell, he replied with a low purr, sitting back in his chair. May I begin, Mr. Richards? Will asked, wanting to end the uncomfortable small talk. But of course. Impress me. He launched into his iago with the pathology of a teenager slashing an unsuspecting teacher's tires. Terence said nothing and stared at him, looking through him as it were. Next. Will didn't let his shock show and jumped into a second piece. Silence. He stood there waiting for Terence to say something. A moment later, he did. I want you to do that again. Only this time, I want you to imagine you are a male stripper. Understand? Perfectly, Will replied, knowing what Terence was after. He began again, looking directly into Terence's eyes. Slowly gyrating his hips, he inched his T-shirt over his head and tossed it in Terence's face. Thank you, Mr. Crosswell. That will be all for Terence, he blurted out, and then coyly whispered, Want to see my balls? There was a short pause while Terence adjusted himself in his chair. Yes, please, he cooed. His eyes followed Will's every move as Will slowly unbuckled his jeans and unzipped his fly. He turned his back on Terence and slid his hands into his jeans. Terence's breathing got heavier. Will quickly turned back to face him, revealing 3 tennis balls. He began to juggle. Terence laughed so hard he started to cough. You're a regular Montjoy, aren't you? He choked. Montjoy was the French herald who delivered a gift of tennis balls to Henry V, instigating a declaration of war by England against France. You are either an idiot who will never work in the theater again or the biggest risk-taker I have ever met. Will took a long breath. He was on thin ice. That took balls. Big brass ones, too, I dare say. Again, Terence paused, licking his lips salaciously. Will's ice was cracking. Finally, Terence found the words. Congratulations, young rogue. Welcome to the Tavern Club. Rehearsals commence in February. A former offer will arrive in the mail next month. Thank you, sir. It is truly an honor to join your Davies. I look forward to your letter. Will shook Terence's hand again, grabbed his T-shirt, and left the room, his mind bounding with excitement. When he reached the door, Terence called out after him, Oh, Will. Yes, sir. May I hang on to these? He gestured to the tennis balls which rested on the table in front of him. Will had forgotten them, preoccupied as he was with his good fortune. Why, of course. A little souvenir of my ballsy young rogue, he laughed suggestively. Will gave him a courtly bow and exited with a flourish. And that was it. Okay, thank you all. Good.